Today we're going to start a series of talks on our ancestors. Primarily, I'm going to talk about the life of the Buddha today, but then the subsequent talks will be mostly on the Chinese Zen masters of the golden age of Zen. So we all know the story of how Shakyamuni Buddha was born as a prince and then left the palace when he was made aware of all the suffering in the world. And he embarked on a journey to understand the source of suffering and how to put an end to it. And we all know how he followed ascetic practices for 6 years before he took nourishment and sat for a week under the Bodhi tree in Magadha. He spent a week with his internal conflicts in the guise of Mara, the fiend, who tried to disrupt his meditation, with firestorms, seductive women, and doubts about who would witness his enlightenment. The Buddha was able to hold his mind steady, and on the 7th morning, he was enlightened when he saw the morning star. And after he was enlightened, the Buddha pondered whether anyone could understand what he experienced, and he almost decided not to teach. So Siddhartha Gotama was born around 567 BCE in a small kingdom just below the Himalayan foothills. His father was chief of the Shakya clan, and it's said that 12 years before his birth, the Brahmins prophesied that he would become either a universal monarch or a great sage. And to prevent him from becoming an ascetic, his father kept him within the confines of the palace. Gotama grew up in princely luxury, shielded from the outside world, entertained by dancing girls and instructed by Brahmins, and trained in archery, swordsmanship, wrestling, swimming, and running. And when he became of age, he married Gopa, who gave birth to a son. He had, as we might say today, everything. And yet, it was not enough. Something as persistent as his own shadow drew him into the world beyond the castle walls. There in the streets of Kapilavastu, he encountered 3 simple things: a sick man, an old man, and a corpse being carried to the burning grounds. Nothing in his life of ease had prepared him for this experience. And when his charioteer told him that all beings are subject to sickness, old age, and death, he could not rest. As he returned to the palace, he passed a wandering ascetic, walking peacefully along the street, wearing the robe and carrying a single bowl of a sadhu. And he resolved to leave the palace in search of the answer to the problem of suffering. He bade his wife and child a silent farewell without waking them, rode to the edge of the forest where he cut his long hair with a sword and exchanged his fine clothes for the simple robes of an ascetic. With these actions, Siddhartha Gotama joined a whole class of men who had dropped out of Indian society to find liberation. There were a variety of methods and teachers, and Gotama investigated many. The deep forest and the teeming marketplace was alive with the sounds of thousands of arguments and opinions. And in this, it was not unlike our own times. Gotama finally settled down to work with two teachers. From Arada Kalama, who had 300 disciples, he learned how to discipline his mind to enter the sphere of nothingness. But even though Arada Kalama asked him to remain and teach as an equal, he recognized that this was not liberation, and he left. Next, Siddhartha learned how to enter the concentration of mind, which is neither consciousness or unconsciousness, from Uddhara Ramaputra. But neither was this liberation, and Siddhartha left his second teacher. After leaving his second teacher, Udraka, Prince Siddhartha was known as ascetic Gotama, and he had 5 friends who had also left the palace and a life of luxury to become ascetics or students of life living poorly. And for 6 years, Gotama struggled and tortured his body while his 5 friends supported and looked after him. I will carry austerity to the utmost, thought Gotama. This is the way to acquire wisdom. He practiced fasting, which was thought to be one of the best ways to acquire wisdom. He lived on a grain of rice each day, and later, nothing at all. His body became so thin that his legs were like bamboo sticks. His backbone was like a rope. His chest was like an incomplete roof of a house. His eyes sank right inside like stones in a deep well. His skin lost its golden color and became black. In fact, he looked like a living skeleton. All bones without any flesh. He suffered terrible pain and hunger, yet continued to meditate. Maybe you've seen some statues of the ascetic Gotama. In one sutra, it said that you could see his backbone through the front, where the stomach is. Another way of torturing his body was to hold his breath for a long time until he felt violent pains in his ears, head, and whole body, and he would fall senseless to the ground. And during the full moon and new moon, he went out into the forest or to a charnel ground, a cemetery, to meditate, wearing rags that he collected from the graveyards and rubbish heaps. He was frightened at first, especially when wild animals came, but he never ran away. He stayed behind bravely in these dreadful places, meditating all the time. For 6 long years he did these practices, and in spite of the great pain and suffering, he did not find wisdom or the answer to his questions. So he reflected on what he was doing. And he thought, why should I fear the happy state that is without sensual desires and without evil ideas? And he says, I don't fear it. In other words, it's a state. where there is no attachment to pleasure, no repulsion or attachment to pain, where there's no good, no bad. And thinking that to himself, he decided he would take some nourishment. And if he just kept depriving his body the way he was, eventually he would just kill himself. And what came to him is that this body, which he was denying, is the very agent of his own liberation. Many times Maizumi Roshi used to tell us to appreciate ourselves. What we're appreciating is our own vehicle, our own agent, our own means for receiving our liberation. And for those 6 years, the Buddha was denying his body. He finally decided these austerities are not the way to enlightenment. He went begging through the village for food to build up his body. When his 5 friends saw that, they were disappointed. They took their bowls and robes and left, wanting nothing more to do with Gotama. In the village, a woman named Sujata offered him a dish of milk and a separate vessel of honey. His strength returned. Siddhartha washed himself in the river and set off to the Bodhi tree, and he spread a mat of kusha grass underneath and crossed his legs and sat. According to a sutra, he said, "Though my skin, my nerves, and my bones should waste away and my lifeblood should dry, I will not leave this seat until I have attained supreme enlightenment." Almost sounds like he hasn't given up the ascetic life, doesn't it? He's still willing to waste away on the cushion. So with that vow, with that aspiration, and with that determination, he sat down under the Bodhi tree to practice Zazen. And of course, everything he had done up to that point prepared him for the Zazen, which was to take place for 1 week. But when he sat down, his struggles were not over. As we all know, having determined to practice Zazen and to sit down, that's when another level of difficulty arises. Of course, it has to do with quieting the mind and focusing the mind. And just like the rest of us, the Buddha had his visitations and his images. As other sutras say, when the Buddha sat down, in order to distract him from his goal, Mara, the fiend, arrived on the scene. Mara is the god of the underworld, and he came to distract the Buddha. So the first thing he did was to assume the form of a messenger with disordered garments, panting in haste, bearing a note from the Shakya princes, which is the house from which the Buddha was a member. And in the message, it was written that Devadatta had usurped the kingdom of Kapilavastu and had entered the Bodhisattva's palace, taken his goods and his wife, and had cast his father into prison, and all the Shakya princes were praying that the Buddha would return to restore peace and order. The whole kingdom was in disarray. And reflecting upon this and what caused Devadatta to misuse the women and the malice that made him imprison some of the members of the clan, and that the princes were neutralized by cowardice and had failed to defend their king, and reflecting on the folly and weakness of the natural heart that further strengthened the Buddha's resolve to attain a higher and better state of enlightenment. So then Mara fell back and regrouped. He decided that he couldn't trick him by subtle means. He was going to come on with a heavy artillery. So he created terrible whirlwinds and storms of rain and a mighty flood, and he cast down showers of rocks and a storm of deadly and poisonous weapons and burning ashes and coals. And according to the sutra, none of this actually fell on the Buddha's head as he sat. Anyway, these were tremendous Makyo experiences, and maybe some of you experienced things like this when you were sitting, seeing things that weren't really there. All kinds of horrific things were going on, but through it all, he continued to sit. And there's some statues of the Buddha show the hood of a big cobra over his head, and it protected him from all the storms and all the conflagrations. In fact, Roshi Shinko on a board out front painted a big cobra behind the stone Buddha statue we have. So having failed with subtle means and with horrific images, Mara decided that he would definitely get the Buddha if he turned to sex. So he brought out his 3 beautiful daughters to seduce the Buddha away from his meditation. And they danced before the Buddha while he was doing zazen, and they were young and beautiful and alive. And they used every talent of seduction that was known to beautiful women. They offered him everything. They offered him paradise. They sang to him about springtime, and they exhibited their supernatural powers of beauty and grace. But it said that the Buddha's heart was not moved. He answered them saying that such pleasure is as brief as a flash of lightning. And because they could not shake his calm, the young daughters of Mara stopped their flirting, and it said they decided to join him. So they started practicing zazen too. At this point, Mara had tried everything, and he was defeated. But he had one more attempt, and he said to the Buddha, "How can you say, with no one to witness your enlightenment, that you are to be enlightened?" And the Buddha touched the earth with one hand and calmly said, "The earth is my witness." And there's statues of the Buddha too, with his hand on the earth. As you know, after the morning, when the Buddha saw the morning star in the east, he was to have said that I and all beings in the great earth have simultaneously attained enlightenment. His very life is witness to his enlightenment. Realizing that, the Buddha's practice was not over. He went on for 49 more years teaching, continually being with others and helping them with their practice. But, it wasn't only the Buddha who had to struggle with his practice, but all of the patriarchs and Zen masters and our ancestors had to go through similar things. And we all become so conditioned in our ways of behaving and thinking. We have to take care of it in one way or another. So what the Buddha learned in those 6 years of struggle is how to practice Zazen, and then sitting down under the tree, he could sit and his mind was steady and calm. Being distracted by horrible visions, by beautiful visions, it wasn't so. Whatever came up went right into his Zazen. Wonder of wonders, he's reported to have said. This very enlightenment is the nature of all beings, and yet they are unhappy for lack of it. So it was that Siddhartha Gotama woke up at the age of 35 and became the Buddha, the awakened one, known as Shakyamuni, the sage of the Shakyas. There are also written accounts that Yashodhara, his wife, was pregnant for the 6 years of Buddha's early practice, and that their son Rahula was born at the same time that the Buddha was awakened. These legends validate the importance of childbearing as being symbolically equivalent to awakening. And also, after the Buddha's enlightenment, later his wife and son joined his order, and his stepmother became the head of an order of nuns. For 7 weeks, the Buddha enjoyed the freedom and tranquility of liberation. At first, he had no inclination to speak about his realization, which he felt would be too difficult for most people to understand. But when, according to legend, a Brahma chief of the 3,000 worlds requested that the awakened one teach, since there are those whose eyes are only a little clouded over, the Buddha agreed. Shakyamuni's 2 former teachers had both died only a few days earlier, and so he sought the 5 ascetics who had left him. When they saw him approaching the Deer Park in Benares, they decided to ignore him, since he had broken his vows. Yet they found something so radiant about his presence that they rose, prepared a seat, bathed his feet, and listened as the Buddha turned the wheel of the Dharma, the teachings, for the first time. The first noble truth of the Buddha stated that all life, all existence is characterized by dukkha, a Sanskrit word meaning suffering, pain, and unsatisfactoriness. Even moments of happiness have a way of turning into pain. When we hold on to them, or once they have passed into memory, they twist the present as the mind makes an inevitable, hopeless attempt to recreate the past. The teaching of the Buddha is based on direct insight into the nature of existence and is a radical critique of wishful thinking and the myriad tactics of escapism, whether through political utopianism, psychological obsession, simple hedonism, or, and it is this which primarily distinguished Buddhism from most of the world's religions, the theistic salvation of mysticism. Dukkha is noble, and it's true. It is a foundation, a stepping stone to be comprehended fully, not to be escaped from or explained. Sooner or later, no matter how comfortable we may feel and no matter how much We have been protected from material want. Life provides us with the opportunity to experience loss, suffering, anguish, and the pain of anxiety over our destiny and that of our loved ones. The experience of dukkha, of the working of one's mind, leads to the second noble truth, the origin of suffering, traditionally described as craving, thirsting for pleasure, and also, and more fundamentally, a thirst for continued existence, and in some cases, as well as a thirst for non-existence. Examination of the nature of this thirst leads to the heart of the second noble truth, the idea of the self, or I, with all its desires, hopes, and fears. And it is only when this self is comprehended and seen as insubstantial that the third noble truth, the cessation of suffering, is realized. The 5 ascetics who listened to the Buddha's first discourse in the Deer Park became the nucleus of a community, a sangha, of men and women who were later allowed to enter, who followed the way the Buddha had described in his 4th noble truth, the Noble Eightfold Path. Those monks lived simply, owning a bowl, a robe, a needle, a water strainer, and a razor, since they shaved their heads as a sign of having left home. They traveled around northeast India practicing meditation alone or in small groups, begging for their meals. The Buddha's teaching, however, was not only for the monastic community. Shakyamuni had instructed them to bring it all forward. He said, "You monks, for the gain of many, the welfare of the many, in compassion for the world, for the good of the gain, for the welfare of gods and men and women." For the next 49 years, Shakyamuni walked through the villages and towns of India, speaking in the vernacular, using common figures of speech that everyone could understand. He taught a villager to practice mindfulness while drawing water from a well. And when a distraught mother asked him to heal the dead child she carried in her arms, he did not perform a miracle, but instead instructed her to bring him a mustard seed from a house where no one had ever died. She returned from her search without the seed, with the knowledge that death is universal. As the Buddha's fame spread, kings and other wealthy patrons donated parks and gardens for retreats. The Buddha accepted these, but he continued to live as he had ever since his 29th year, as a wandering sadhu, begging his own meal, spending his days in meditation. Only now there was one difference. Almost every day after his noon meal, the Buddha taught. None of these discourses or questions and answers that followed were recorded during the Buddha's lifetime. The Buddha died in the town of Kusinagara at the age of 80, having eaten a tainted meal of pork, or some say mushrooms. Since the assembled monks were despondent, The Buddha, lying on his side with his head resting on his right hand, reminded them that everything is impermanent and advised them to take refuge in themselves and the Dharma, the teachings. He asked for questions the last time, but there were none. Then he spoke his final words. Now then, monks, I address you. All compound things are subject to decay. Strive diligently. The first rainy season after the Buddha's parinirvana, or his death, it is said that 500 elders gathered in a mountain cave near Rajagriha, where they held the first council. Ananda, who had been the Buddha's attendant, repeated all the discourses or sutras he had heard. And Upali recited the 250 monastic rules, the Vinaya, while Mahakashapa recited the Abhidharma, the compendium of Buddhist psychology and metaphysics. These three collections, which were written on palm leaves a few centuries later, are known as the Tripitaka, which means the three baskets, and they became the basis for all subsequent versions of the Buddhist canon. That's the sutras, the Vinaya, and the Abhidharma. So the basic choice between the spiritual life and the worldly life confronts us all. Sometimes we hear teachers exhorting us to abandon our attachments and to persist in the choice to strive for awakening. Every day we make choices that determine the future path of our lives. We face this choice again and again in the course of our everyday activities. In the case of the Buddha, it seems so simple and straightforward. He begged for food and slept under the stars. How about in the age of cell phones, the internet, and instant communication? So, can we have both enlightenment and the good life? Goethe said, the moment one definitely commits oneself, then providence moves too. All sorts of things occur to help one that would otherwise not have occurred. A whole stream of events issues from the decision to commit oneself, raising in one's favor all manner of unseen incidents, unforeseen incidents, and meetings and assistance which no person could have dreamed would have come his or her way. There's no substitute for really committing ourselves to practice, committing ourselves to session. If you're always going to wait for the right moment, that moment never comes. The moment's right now. So I encourage you to look at your intention and renew it, and enter Zen from there. After 2,500 years of continuous practice, Shakyamuni Buddha is still sitting right here, right now. Let's all sit. As Shakyamuni Buddha said, I and all sentient beings everywhere and the great earth are simultaneous enlightened. I and Shakyamuni Buddha are simultaneously doing Zazen. Thank you.